All right, welcome to day 2 of the painting boot camp. Today we're going to do 6 different techniques using watercolors. So the whole day, the whole period is just going to be using the watercolor technique. Please make sure you've written your name and period at the top if you haven't already. The first technique is called wet on dry. We're going to fill this box in now because in order to paint wet paint onto dry paint, we need to have dry paint there. So I'm going to start by taking my brush, adding a little paint into the blue paint. You don't have to use blue, but that's the color that I'm going to choose to use. If the paint is kind of tacky, meaning it's a little bit sticky because there's been a lot of water in there over the past few days because students have been painting a lot, just make sure you're not digging that paint out. You should be just using a little bit of the water that is on the surface of the paint. Your paint should be pretty transparent, so this is looking pretty dark. I'm just going to add a little bit of water to move it around and lighten it up. With watercolors, the best way to lighten your paint is to just add a little bit of water. Okay, so I'm going to let this little section dry for a while and come back to it later. You can actually, if your paint is transparent enough, you can paint over the words if you would like, as long as you can still see the words after. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry and move on to wet on wet. The wet on wet technique, and I'm cleaning my brush by rubbing it on the bottom of the bucket. Okay, the wet on wet technique is where you just take water, make sure your water is clean, add it to your area, and then you can go in with any color you would like, and you'll see it kind of bleeds on its own. So, lots of water when using watercolors. Okay. This is a great technique to get cool backgrounds, and once they're dry, you can also do dry painting on top. Now I'm going to mix a little bit of orange on this side and let it kind of blend together. Okay. Almost looks like a tie-dye. All right. Now, the next technique is taping. This one is really fun. You take masking tape. It actually works best with painter's tape, which is usually blue. But you want to just put a couple pieces of tape down. And I'm just going to do 2. And then you can paint in the area. Of course, we're going to let it dry. Now, this is not just a watercolor technique. You can definitely do this with other paints as well. Okay. Orange. Okay, we're going to let that dry. Should be pretty dry before you peel the tape off, or else it's gonna move around. Okay, blotting. Now let's say you're painting, you have a really dark color and you want it a little bit lighter. What you can do, and I might just mix a few colors next to each other. Okay. Or maybe you just want to add a little texture. You can take a paper towel, and I just kind of fold it up. If you want some nice texture, you can ball it up, and you just want to pull some of that paint out. Now when I blot, I definitely want to be careful about not rubbing the paint and using a clean spot. But you can practice doing that. Okay. Watercolor pencils and liquid watercolors are the last 2. So watercolor pencils look just like colored pencils. I have a nice set here. This is the big set. This one you have to ask me for, but for today you can use it. Now, In this area, if you want to do a little sketch first, you can, that's fine. You don't have to. If you just want to go in with your pencils and start drawing, you can. But your goal is to just use them like regular colored pencils. So I'm drawing a flower and some grass here, and it's kind of nice to layer a little bit, meaning I have a little bit of this dark green, and maybe it's going to go from dark to light green. And when you add the water to it, so the idea is that you're going to add water to this, you will see it'll blend, it'll turn to paint and it'll blend pretty nicely. Okay, so you're going to want to kind of complete a little drawing in here, and then the goal is to add water and watch it turn to paint. Now for the sake of time, I am not going to finish my drawing, but I do just want to show you what it looks like. So for this one, maybe it goes from orange and then finishes with a deeper color. Okay. I just want to show you what it looks like. So once you have your drawing done, or pretty much done, you want to take clean water, and you might need to change the water in your container, and you just add water to your colored pencil, and it turns to paint. Now if you want it really light, you can see in this area, I'm just going over the tips here of the grass, and the color is still on my brush. If you want it darker, you gotta push a little harder, and you gotta really color in more. So you can sort of see the difference between these two areas. All right, the last area is liquid watercolors. Liquid watercolors are super messy, so you gotta be really careful with them. They come in these bottles, and they're in the back of the room with the other paints. What I did is I took a palette like this. I'm gonna be giving you guys a palette with a lid on it, I believe, but you know, you can see they're really watery, they move around, they're not thick at all, and when they spill, they make a big giant mess. So you wanna be really careful with the liquid watercolors. Okay, so I would say you can try the wet on wet technique with the liquid watercolors. Maybe just use a small area since the box is kind of small, and you'll see the wet on wet technique looks awesome with the liquid watercolors. It really spreads and moves around. I kind of like it to take its own path. One thing you can experiment with is just taking water and maybe drawing a line and then seeing if you can get the paint to follow the line. So liquid watercolors are really, really fun. And then you can also, of course, try the blotting technique with this as well. So if you have an area you want to add some texture to it, you should use a clean paper towel. I just got this little spot here that's clean, and you can do kind of the same thing, pull that color up. And then of course, if you just want to paint with more control, you can use the tip of your brush and get some nice details here. So I would just experiment doing the blotting, doing the wet on wet technique, and then also just trying to have a little more control with your paint. Remember, any wet areas that are next to wet areas like that are gonna definitely bleed. All right, let's go back to the wet on dry. I'm almost done. For this one, you're using just your regular watercolors again, which are the watercolor cakes. I guess they're not really regular, but they're the watercolor cakes. And for this, maybe I'm going to draw a little land here. It's almost totally dry. We'll call it good enough. Maybe I've got a palm tree. I like when I'm doing the layering on top, I tend to not make it as watery. So a little bit of water here. But the idea is that you're trying to make it look like the blue is the background and you're painting with the wet paint on top of the dry paint, okay? So it's important with painting that you think about layering. Okay, I've got my sun here. And then if your blue is kind of watery and you wanted to do a dark blue on top that's not as watery, you could also layer blue on top of blue. Okay, so that's wet on dry, and then of course the last one is peeling the tape off. It might not be totally ready, but for the sake of the video, I'm gonna do it. Now when I peel, I don't peel up, I peel kind of really close to the paper. A little bit of that paper is coming off, which is why it's good to use painter's tape. Okay. Trying to be careful because it's not totally dry. All right. All right, you guys, good luck with these.